So welcome back, everyone. It's now 11 o'clock in Central Europe, and we are moving on with our second panel of today, which has to do with European accessibility standards. And please do stay awake because this is really important and interesting, even if standardization sometimes make people feel otherwise. So we have, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have a situation where we are now updating the standard that acts as presumed conformance for the Web Accessibility Directive, and that is, of course, to support the European Accessibility Act. So that is kind of a moving target right now, and we will hear a little bit more about that from Shadi Abuzara, who is not only the Principal Accessibility Standards and Policy Manager at Amazon, but he's also has been part of the Special Task Force editing the standard, and is also a member of the Joint Technical Body, which is assigned to make sure that we create consensus around these European standards. Then we will hear from another monitoring agency, so this time from Ireland, so Aislinn Conway, who is a Senior Standards and Monitoring Officer for the Web Accessibility Directive at the National Disability Authority in Ireland. And she will talk about how they go about these requirements that are going beyond WCAG, where there is no understanding documentation, because that is a common issue for many stakeholders. So we will hear how a monitoring agency handles that. And then we will end this session with Malin Hammarberg, who is a UX designer and accessibility specialist, but also part of the IAAP Nordic Advisory Council and also the IAAP Ethics Committee. And who will talk about the work that we have been doing within IAAP for a couple of years, where we try to make sure that different stakeholders work together to align or make sure that we interpret these EN beyond requirements in a good way. And as I mentioned earlier, we will have a full report on the results of yesterday's workshop on the 23rd of October. So this is more of a general overview. So with that, I think Shadi is the first one out.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, excellent, exciting topic. Standards. I love standards. I think everybody who knows me knows that. So I don't get bored of that. I just get all jazzed up. So let's talk about the EN 301549 version 4.1.1, which is the version that is currently in development, that is to be published. So I'm giving you the updates on behalf of Mike Klug, who is the chair of this committee that is developing this standard. I am just a member in that committee since its inception, actually, but just standing in and trying to explain the updates that so far in the latest draft. So given the brief timeline, yes, I think the biggest change is moving from WCAG 2.1 to WCAG 2.2. I think this was expected, not really a big surprise. In clause 9, which is the section in the EN 31549 that focuses on web, it's really straight up. WCAG 2.2, it's actually using links to refer out. We know that from the current version already. So it's linking out to WCAG 2.2 to the latest version here. For so-called non-web documents, that's clause 9 of EN 31549, is it's using the guidance document from WCAG called WCAG to ICT, which doesn't really say what to do for things outside web, because that's not really the work of WCAG. WCAG focuses on web, but it says if you would want to apply WCAG to documents or to non-web software, as it is called, then here are some things you can consider. So this guidance has been used by the committee of EN 31549 to develop clause 10. So it's more or less WCAG 2.2, WCAG 2.2, but with some minor edits. For example, you don't really have sets of documents or multi-page forms, things like that. as common in documents as you have on web. So these are the kinds of differences. Moving on, for clause 11, now that gets a bit more difficult. So I put a small plus using WCAG to ICT plus. So it's still using the guidance of WCAG to ICT, but with a little more thought, because software is just so broad, and WCAG wasn't really intended for the whole breadth of software. It makes sense for certain kinds of apps, but when you apply it to the whole dimensions of all kinds of software, then you really need to think about how to embed this. But it's more or less these three sections are based on WCAG 2.2. So that's really the biggest change, and will also impact the Web Accessibility Directive, I think, because web and apps and software and clause 9. One of the biggest changes you'll also see, moving on, is quite significant restructuring and rewording, at the same time trying to maintain the current numbering and structure. You don't want to really start everything from scratch and change things too much. So that was quite a complex task here to kind of simplify things. The first change is really a big cleanup of open and closed functionality. And this is a tricky thing. It might not be as applicable to the Web Accessibility Directive. Most of the time you're dealing with so-called open functionality, which means a website or an app where you don't really know what software, what assistive technologies the consumer is using, the end user, to access that. But in certain kinds of closed functionality, think of an ATM, for example, where you can't install anything, you can't bring in your own keyboard. So that has to provide its own functionality, its own assistive features to a certain degree. And this was very messy, especially in clause 11. There were sub clauses separating open and closed functionality. There's been a lot of cleanup to really clear that a little bit. Next bullet is simplification of clause 11. I think that's going to be quite significant. But also things have moved, for example, to section 5, which is about general requirements and so on, to streamline the entire document. Another thing that I'm really happy with, that I think it makes the requirements much longer and maybe more difficult to read because it's longer sentences, but it actually puts the preconditions directly as part of the requirement. So far, you were reading a requirement, and then you had to actually go to Annex C to read up the actual testing procedure to find out that there are some preconditions that only applies to certain situations or certain things. Now, these preconditions are all part of the requirement itself. There is sentence break, so a line break to try to kind of break up the long sentences a little bit to make it easier to read. So there was a bit of a balance between having longer sentences that are more difficult to read and between putting all the requirements in one place. So restructuring and rewording is really the second biggest change. I was asked to name the 5 biggest change or 5 most significant changes. Moving on to number 3 is authoring tools. I think we all know how important authoring tools are, and they were existing in the current version of EN 31549, but at the back of section 9.7 or whatever it was, I don't remember, it was somewhere in clause 9. This has now been moved to clause 5. Which makes it, and clause 5 again are the general requirements. So the thought was there's a lot of things that generate content, also apps that generate content and could be considered authoring tools as well. So why limit that to web only? Why not move that up to clause 5 and make it more generally applicable? So that means the impact here of that, moving on one bullet, that really impacts any ICT that creates content, in particular apps, but it actually has a much broader impact when we go beyond web and mobile for the European Accessibility Act. So that's change number 3. I think that I see it very positive that authoring tools are being more heavily promoted. Now, something that might not impact as many of you, but also relevant for the Web Accessibility Directive are bidirectional communication. So if you are developing a software, an online teleconferencing tool, for example, or things like that, until the current version, there were still some limitation on what really interoperability means. And there's an introduced section 6.0 to not interfere with the numbering. Again, this is part of the restructuring rewriting that really sets a lot of much clearer interoperability requirements. And that's a big step forward. We know this was an issue with the previous version, 3.2.1, or it's actually the current version. 6.2 also provides better requirements for multi-party real-time text. So when you have, again, a teleconferencing system is a good example of that, when you have multiple people at the same time using real-time text, which is something that is very important with people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And then finally, also better alignment with the another standard in development for the IAA, currently with the number 103919. It's on emergency communication. This is mainly for the public access points that are actually answering the calls, but this is a very important standard to ensure accessible communication for people with disabilities in emergency situations. So there's better alignment now between these two standards. Okay, that was number 4. And then moving on to number 5, that doesn't impact as much the Web Accessibility Directive, but I think it's worth mentioning because it's a big change. There's also been quite some changes on hardware, quite some alignment with another standard in development for the IAA on the built environment. Here, imagine a kiosk or a ATM or something, a freestanding one that has its own, that is freestanding versus one that is mounted on a wall. Would you really want to have different measurements here? It's very difficult because these have very different jurisdictions and very different ownerships of who is regulating what. But one also important change is just rethinking what operable parts and reach and interaction means. At the time of where the actual requirements came from are actually go back to the 70s, maybe even, or 80s with male US veterans. And it was mainly things that the most common ICT was maybe a telephone booth, maybe an ATM. The first ATMs were appearing and things like that, but it wasn't really the touch screens and things that could change positions and so on. So need to really rethink about that. And then there are newly introduced dimensions currently as recommendations. So these are the 5 biggest changes. What are the next steps? First of all, completion of the final draft. Now that's not a grammatic typo. This is actually, there was already a final draft out for comments, but there still continues to be editor drafts in between, and the cleanup is happening until end of September, this September. So we're really in the final stages here of wrapping up the standard. And then it will go into a 3 months balloting period until the end of the year sometime. And then we hope, if that is successful, it will be formally published by ETSI and the other, and Senelec, the 3 standards organizations, the so-called triple logo standard, by early next year, if again successful, by February. And then is the big question mark, one more step, is the actual formal adoption of that by the European Commission in its official journal as a harmonized standard, as a harmonized European norm. Whether that will happen, we expect that this will be aligned, both the Web Accessibility Directive and the European Accessibility Act, but how exactly that will happen is still to be confirmed by the European Commission. So maybe mid next year, if we're lucky, we will have this new standard be actually applicable both for the Web Accessibility Directive and the European Accessibility Act. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shadi, for this very brief overview. I know both of you could have talked about these standards for days, but we tried to make a short overview, and I think that was very useful for people who have not been involved. So thanks a lot for making this understandable. And now we move to Ireland for a visit to the National Disability Authority of Ireland and Aislinn Conway, who will talk to us about how the monitoring agency of Ireland is handling the issues of all of these standards and requirements that can sometimes be a bit tricky. So thank you for being here with us today, Aislinn.
Thank you, Susanna, and good morning, everyone. I am joining you today on a very sunny and fresh autumnal day from Galway on the west coast of Ireland. It's an honour to speak at this session as part of the celebration for the 5th anniversary. So by way of introduction, my name is Aislinn Conway, and I recently stepped into the role of Senior Standards and Monitoring Officer with the National Disability Authority, or NDA, in Ireland, a post which was previously held by the very brilliant Dr. Donal Rice, who many of you will be familiar with and who has made a huge contribution to the monitoring of the WAD in Ireland. So just to get started. So about the NDA, first of all. So the NDA is the independent statutory body providing evidence-based advice and research to government on disability policy and practice and promoting universal design. So the NDA is named in Irish regulations as the national monitoring body for the purposes of monitoring compliance with and reporting on the Web Accessibility Directive. And within the NDA, the Web Accessibility Directive team is based at the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design. And we're dedicated to enabling the design of the built and digital environments, including services and systems that can be accessed, understood, and used regardless of a person's age, size, ability, or disability. So next slide, please. So the EU WAD monitoring reviews by the NDA. So for now, I'd like to talk about the monitoring of the WAD, which was transposed into Irish law on this day 5 years ago. So we undertake two types of reviews. First of all, the simplified reviews, they're on a subset of WCAG 2.1. So the coverage is about 57%, and we use a product from DQ called Axe Monitor. They are weekly scans carried out, and they're fully automated, and there are a large number of pages, up to 400. And annually, we undertake approximately 230 simplified reviews. And then in-depth reviews, they look at WCAG 2.1 and EN 301549. And for these, we use another product from DQ called Axe Monitor. They're once-off reviews. They include automated and manual testing tools, and we look at fewer pages, so approximately up to 20. And annually, we will undertake about 30 in-depth reviews on websites and mobile applications. So the Unlike in WCAG, EN 301-549 requirements do not have understanding documentation as has been discussed. And for the requirements not found in WCAG 2.1, this leads to uncertainty and confusion around application, interpretation and testing. And here are some of the clauses that this covers. If you would like more details on these, I would highly recommend that you access the document developed by IAAP Nordic, which lists more than 60 minimum requirements that go beyond WCAG, and it's available at that URL. So next slide, please. So because we only have a few minutes, I'm just going to point to a classic example. So 11.7, which looks at user preferences. And this is a requirement. It's one example that does not have understanding and documentation. This requirement says that mobile apps and websites must respect user preferences relating to units of measurements, color, contrast, font type, font size, and the focus cursor, and it can be set in operating systems or browsers. But the definitions and scope of this requirement are unclear, and this has been, I know, discussed in depth by Malin in a recorded presentation last year, which is available online. Excellent presentation. And so basically there's no agreed methodology for testing this, although our current monitoring partner DQ does have a testing methodology for the requirement for mobile apps, but not for websites. Next slide, please. So kind of to sum up, monitoring bodies have lots of difficulties with testing the EN 301-549 clauses outside of WCAG, and the NDA is no different in this respect. From a policy perspective, we don't test clauses for which there is not an agreed methodology for testing. And that's because as a monitoring body, we do not want to take an ad hoc approach to monitoring compliance with requirements that are meant to harmonize accessibility requirements. So for us, that would not be optimal policy implementation. So I was unable to attend yesterday's workshop as part of the anniversary relating to the minimum requirements to go beyond WCAG. So I was excited to hear of the update just now from Shadi, and I'm also excited to hear more in the report that will be developed and from Malin in the session afterwards, as because I suppose as a monitoring body, we expect to see better testing methods for non-WCAG clauses in the new version of EN 301-549. And I will hand you back to Susanna. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aislinn, for that presentation. And I want to again stress that there are many more testing tools and companies providing testing tools in the world. So one was mentioned here several times, but there are also others. So now, and here is, sorry, I forgot your last slide. So here we also have some information about how you can get in contact with NDA in Ireland. So now we will have the third presentation in this session, and that is Malin Hammarberg, who will talk to us a little bit about the workshops that we have been doing to make sure that we can align on how we interpret and understand and test the requirements that go beyond WCAG.
Hi. So yesterday we concluded our fifth, if I counted correctly, EM Beyond workshop. And they are always such a great time and very nerdy. So to understand how nerdy, in each group, we deep dive in to explore one single requirement in EN 301-549 that goes beyond WCAG for hours, actually, with the goal to make that requirement understandable and work in practice for the practitioners that use the European standard. So when we started this workshop series, we kept hearing the same frustration from testers, accessibility experts, and monitoring agencies. People were saying, I don't really understand what this requirement is asking for, or they had the standard, but they struggled with the practical application, like How do you actually fulfill this or test this? What tools should I use? When is it even applicable? Just to give you an idea of the scope, and Aislinn said it's more than 60 requirements, but the number beyond WCAG requirements in EN 301-549 version, the current version 3.2.1, there's 42 additional requirements for web and 64 additional requirements for mobile apps. With the restructuring of the new version, we'll see how many those requirements will be in the future. So over the past year, since the spring 2024, we've been all over Europe having these workshops. So we've been in Paris, we've been in Brussels, Helsinki, Brno, and yesterday we went online for the very first time. Very exciting. We're bringing together diverse participants from across Europe and far beyond as well. So monitor agencies, accessibility experts, and most importantly, end users who are an integral part of this process. All to understand what's missing and what support is needed beyond the standard to understand these extra requirements. The biggest aha moment during these workshops is that we're not just dealing with unclear requirements, we're actually dealing with fundamentally different interpretation of the same text across Europe. So what passes as compliance in one country might fail compliance in another because we are reading the text differently because it's a bit ambiguous. So how can we get everyone on the same page? Well, we started these workshops, and the outcome of them, what we hope, is to generate some kind of practical guidance or understanding document. And to be honest, we're not quite there yet, but the goal is to fill the gaps between what the standard says and what the practitioners need to know. So this document or information we're trying to create is not part of the standard, but rather supporting the standard. So most importantly, I want to note here, we always say this, no person, organization or company owns the results from the workshop or anything we will produce now or in the future. This is open and free for all to use. So we've been sharing the insights and outcomes of what is ambiguous, hard to understand, and we found that that we found in the different requirements during our workshop with the special task force that's working on the update for EN 301-549. And I know that some of our findings have inspired changes in the new versions, which is so exciting, I think, and a great first step. So in our last workshop, and the one yesterday, we explored the latest drafts of the standard and revisited some of the beyond requirements we had covered earlier. And we explored what had changed, what still needs extra support or framing in those requirements. And it was a real positive experience to see that our work has inspired and improved the standard. So these workshops that we have shows that there are real demand for these workshops, and it's a true honor being a part of the initiative. And before I end, I want to say a large thank you to my brilliant fellow facilitators. I'm sharing the time with one of them, Shadi, and also the equally brilliant participants in all of these workshops. You are making these workshops so rewarding, inspiring, and fun, and the outcome we have, even if it's not really published anywhere, is a really good base. So now we just need to make sure that these insights don't stay in the room and that we can share it with all you somehow, somewhere.
Okay, thank you very much, Malin, for this little overview. Well done in 5 minutes. And I actually think that we started the workshops already in 2023, but we can argue about the date later on. So, and you said the last one, but I think it was the latest. I hope we will continue, and we will for sure do, at least in Ireland in November, there will be the next edition of those. So as long as nobody stops us, we will continue doing the workshops. And they are one of the most popular things IAAP EU is doing. So even if we think it's rather nerdy, it's definitely something that people like. So now I would like to ask the panelists here, how big an issue is it really that member states do interpret the supposedly harmonized requirements differently? And for whom is this a problem? Because really, I mean, June already said that it's difficult to compare anyway, because even the monitoring of WCAG requirements is different, and the monitoring agencies do it differently, and so on. So who? I mean, we want it to be kind of order and structure and the same, but who are we failing when we are not doing this the same way? Shadi, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, everyone. I think we're failing everyone. I can speak from an industry perspective. It's very difficult to have to maintain or follow or track different jurisdictions in different places. I think one of the biggest accomplishments that we've achieved in accessibility as a community together is harmonizing accessibility standards internationally. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and increasingly the EN 31549 is being adopted internationally more and more. I think this is a big accomplishment. Speaking as a person with disability, my disability doesn't change when I go from one country to another. And so I think that's something that is also really important. It accelerates accessibility for people with disabilities. So fragmented accessibility slows down implementation, and that impacts people with disabilities. It also doesn't benefit governments to have to reinvent the wheel over and over again, and the resources. June mentioned at the beginning that there has been exchange between the countries and sharing of know-how, sharing of accessibility experts. If I go and work in a different EU country, I can take the knowledge with me. I don't have to relearn things, and we already have very limited resources. I could go on forever, but I think the point is quite clear that I think this is really damaging to everyone, and it's counter the actual purpose of these directives, particularly the European Accessibility Act, which is an internal market law, trying to address a harmonized internal EU market. So then we come and start breaking it. But at the same time, I must say, maybe the standards also need more work, could be written, in a better way. So there's work for us to do as standards developers, but there's also definitely a lot of work on shared between all stakeholders to move this forward.
Thank you. And I want to go back to Aislinn, because you said that you are not testing these requirements because there is no formal or agreed monitoring methodology, but I'm not a lawyer, but I think that you are then not doing what is expected of you as a monitor. I mean, that's a really difficult situation. I'm not starting an argument about this, but I mean, it's a problem if this lack of harmonized methodology of testing is leading to member states actually not doing what they are supposed to do according to the law. So this must be an issue. Have you done something to mitigate or to raise this with the Commission, or?
So thanks, Susanna. So just, I suppose, to echo what Shadia said, it is a big issue for member states harmonizing requirements differently. I think it's a big issue for governments. It's a big issue for us as a monitoring body, and for those involved as well in the policy implementation, and for the end users, including persons with disabilities, older adults, wider population, everyone. So that's why I guess we have made the decision that we have made and that I've talked about, just because we believe that is the best way forward for us, it might not be agreeable, I suppose, to other monitoring bodies or countries. But until there is, I suppose, adequate guidance and supporting documentation, that is the decision that we've made.
And many other monitoring bodies, or member states, they do monitor in their own way. So Malin, as an accessibility expert, you are doing audits all around Europe. So what's your perspective on this? Who is, I mean, it's irritating for us, but I mean, who is really who are we failing most? Or is it, as Shadi says, everyone?
It harms everyone. I think I can see two main problems, because depending on who's doing the audit or in what country the audit is been done, then companies can get different answers, like you're passing this one or you're failing this one. And that creates kind of uncertainty and extra cost trying to navigate and interpret the same standard. But also, most critically, as Shadi said several times, and Aislinn as well, the different levels of accessibility in different countries affects the end user with disabilities and undermines kind of the whole point of the harmonized standard, where we are supposed to take it the same way. And Aislinn talked about one of my favorite requirements, user preferences. And this is a perfect example of one of those requirements that actually has been interpreted differently in different countries. So different user preferences is added depending on what country you look at. And probably whatever accessibility expert you talk to, they have different views of what user preferences needs to be working. So I think that this is a huge problem, and the only one that's truly affected by it is the end user in the end, because they can't kind of count on it being the same if they travel around Europe or use sites from another country.
Yeah, so we have established that this is important for many different stakeholders, although I would like to add that also some of the WCAG requirements are interpreted differently, but that's kind of another. This is kind of a big black hole, but this is maybe the low-hanging fruit that we should try to do something about. And IAAP and many other kind of family and friends of us, we are trying to do something in discussion, but that's not a formal thing, and it's not establishing something that Aislinn would say this is established methodology. So even if Malin and I think this, or I hope also the other panelists think that this is a good initiative, what is kind of needed for this to become formal? I mean, obviously that wouldn't kind of solve the issue, even if we come up with the document. So what is actually needed here? Aislinn, what is the solution for this, for you to start monitoring these requirements?
So I'm very hopeful that the guidance and documentation and the new standard will take huge strides towards improving things for us and other monitoring bodies, and that we'll be able to move forward with monitoring and improving our monitoring practices. I think that, I suppose, gaining buy-in is going to be really, really key. And obviously productive collaboration, and there's already been a lot of that, and meaningful stakeholder engagement as well. And I think so for any other remaining issues outside of what the, I suppose, IAAP are currently looking at, I think there needs to be a focused strategy, just taking into account barriers and facilitators as they come up. I imagine that it'll be a very iterative process.
Mm-hmm. And Shadi, I can imagine your response, but I'll let you speak.
Well, I mean, I'm a firm believer in this work, and been doing as much as I can to support it. I think it's an important step. I think it's really important. It has already had an impact in terms of improving requirements in the upcoming version, right? And the upcoming version will hopefully also not be the last but the latest, and so that we will see more improvements as Lynn was saying, see iterations. This takes time. I think we also need some vetting and some So WCAG provides, W3C provides the understanding WCAG documentation. And I see over and over again how really useful it is and how important, and they can be edited more easily. They can explain what the working group really intended, what it meant. And then they do go back and adjust that when they learn things, when things change, technologies change, technologies evolve. And so I think such a documentation by a board, I think it's really great. It's very important. But how to make that a bit more official or recognized or something, and how do we solve potential conflicts if we say, well, we think it should be interpreted that way, but actually that wasn't what was intended initially. So there needs to be a bit of a link back. I still don't know how that works, Susanna, because that's depends on many other parameters, how Etsy works and how they're willing, so at least you started off this grassroots work, which I think is really important. But we'll see how we can actually formalize it once it matures a bit and try to make this feedback loop a bit more intentional and a bit more this link between the normative document and the informative material a bit more intentional is the best word I can come up with.
Yeah. Do you have something to add, Malin, to that?
No, I think you said it before with WCAG that requirements are interpreted differently, but there is that supportive document. So for anyone that's interested in how can I do it the best way, they can read that, but that's an informal document. And I think this will also be some kind of informal document that is supporting document to the standard. I think it's really valuable, but and I hope that the end result will kind of help with real world examples. So it's easy for the monitoring agency to understand what the intent of the requirement is. But honestly, I'm not sure who should be responsible for it and making this kind of some kind of official or ensuring the consistency applies kind of across member states. We're trying to fill a gap, but someone needs to kind of own the solution, I think. And
yeah, and just to be clear, we have tried to make it into a formal document. So far, we haven't been successful, but we keep trying. So stay tuned. I will not give up until I retire. And that may come early. I think what we can say is that we have at least started to get people who were not previously involved in standardization into thinking about these things. And I think even if that is the only step we have, kind of the only thing we have succeeded with, I think that is a big step as well, because standardization tends to be kind of a closed thing. And I'm very happy that when I became chair, that we also started being more transparent, and that is now a GitLab where you can follow the drafts of the EN 301-549 and so on. And we are also trying to make sure that both the process and the outcome becomes more accessible. We got a question from the audience about the drafts of the other standards, but unfortunately, I'm not in charge of them, and there are different processes in the different kinds of standards bodies. And as far as I know, the built environment standard is not shared before it's kind of on an official or public round. So we cannot share that right now. You need to be part of the standardization organizations to see the things. And that is kind of a logic to that, a business logic, but not really happy with it, if you ask me personally. But Shadi has asked me to not try to restructure the whole world of standardization and how all the standardization organizations work in this life, but kind of wait for it to next life to start doing that. But I would like to finalize this with asking all of the participants here, if you could change, or if somebody could change or improve just one thing when it comes to either how standards are developed or the resulting documents, or kind of making them easier to understand or whatever, what would be the most important things? Because we all work with standards, we find them important, but we also see a lot of barriers and problems with standards, and we get all sorts of criticism from the rest of the community around how the standards are made. So Malin, if you could just change one thing, what would be the most important?
I had 3 things I thought about.
Okay, but then three short ones is okay.
Okay, so more precise, less ambiguous language would help everyone. Greater inclusion of people with disabilities in the actual development of the process. And please present the format. The best format isn't a PDF from 1920 with 200 plus pages. So make the standards as accessible as what they are trying to regulate. That would be my 3 points.
Thank you. No real news there, but important points. And Aislinn, what's your take on this? What is the most important part from a monitoring agency perspective?
So one of the things that has come up just with talking with colleagues is they have, asked for kind of the improvement in the accessibility of the process of the various documents. So, for example, timelines can preclude involvement by persons with disabilities. So in a recent case, there was an extremely tight turnaround on a submission of comments for a version of EN 301549, and for anyone who may have needed the documents in an alternative or a more accessible format, it would have been impossible to provide these documents and allow time for the individual to read them and to provide comments, and then to hold the mirror committee meetings within the allocated ballot period. So again, accessibility.
Yeah, we got that question also from the audience, that if the new version will be in an accessible format, and I actually cannot promise that, but we know that the Canadians, they managed to do what the Europeans haven't done in 15 years or something. So there is now an HTML version of the current version of the EN standard. So I hope that if the European standardization organizations do not achieve that goal, then the Canadians will show us how to do it. That's at least my hope. Shaming again as a way of moving things forward. Shadi, I'll let you finish this. What is the most important? What the one change you want to see?
I actually don't recall holding you back, trying to change. I'm all for it. I'll run with you on that. I actually see a big issue is in how standards are developed is largely broken. I think there's a big difference between how different standards organizations operate. Some strive and try to be more open and have as many people at the table as possible, and a multi-stakeholder approach. And I think that's really key. The downside is it takes ages, it takes forever, because the more people you have on the table, the more discussions, the more difficult it gets to actually understand the different perspectives. I don't know how long WCAG 3 has been in development and still will be in development. Don't hold your breath for that. But it is the one opportunity to really provide something different, going from a checklist approach. At least that's my hope for the new version of WCAG, to go from a checklist approach to really a user-centered aspect. We were discussing a little bit earlier about all the issues in the web accessibility, that like the issue lists, but I keep asking myself, does a conformance issue really mean less accessibility? Two websites, could have both not completely conform to the standards, but still one is much more accessible than the other. So the standards right now don't really give us a good understanding of how accessible something is. They just tell us yes, no, and that is actually counter to the user-centered aspect. So that is my wish, that we can have better standards in a more inclusive approach, multi-stakeholder, but that means it's going to be much longer timelines also to include Aislinn, to provide these timelines, to provide this input would have meant several more years of development, which maybe would then be the better approach. I'm not exactly sure, but I do think that right now, at least the European standards development is very closed and very exclusive. And so I think that's part of the issue, why we see things that haven't been fully baked and are hard to interpret afterwards.
True. And it's just funny that we are now talking about making it even slower. I don't think that standardization is seen as a super quick process, even today, even if I do agree that we have had some really quick turnarounds. For several procedural reasons. Okay, thank you very much, and I hope everyone has stayed awake. Thank you for my exclusive panelists here who have done a really good job in making standards interesting and important. And now we will break for lunch for 1 hour, and we will meet again at 1:45 Central European time. So take care, everyone, and move away from your keyboards and do something else, eat something, have coffee or water or something. And then when we meet again, we will meet the end users. So the most important people, sorry everyone else speaking today, but the end users are always the most important to us. So welcome back, 12:45.